Hello, everyone. Welcome to this lunch briefing. Sorry for the noise. It's going to go away very soon, we hope. Welcome to the lunch briefing with Professor Gita Steiner-Khamsi. My name is Diego Gutierrez, and I'm delighted to help moderate the session today. Our speaker today, Gita Steiner-Khamsi, is a professor at the Graduate Institute and also a professor at Columbia University. She joined the Institute in 2017, and she kept this dual affiliation between Columbia and the Institute, and she splits her time in between New York and Geneva. She's also the director of the Network for International Policies and Cooperation in Education and Training, which goes by the acronym NORRAG. And in case you're interested in learning more about NORRAG, you will have brochures and publications on the table at the entrance to the auditorium. Gita did her PhD in social psychology in the University of Zurich with a minor in sociology and anthropology. And she then devoted 10 years of her work to the Ministry of Education at the Canton of Zurich, where she built the first policy research unit dealing with multicultural education. She also enjoyed a 3-year postdoc grant that allowed her to travel to the US, Canada, and the UK, where she was examining education policies with regard to asylum seekers, immigrants, and ethnic minorities from a very international comparative perspective. And she joined the faculty of Columbia University in 1995, and as I said, in 2017, she also became a professor with the Graduate Institute. Throughout 8 books and numerous publications, book chapters, and reports, she's been dealing with issues such as transnational policy borrowing and lending, global governance in education, the global education industry, and as we will see today, public-private partnerships in education. In terms of geographical focus, she's been focusing on Mongolia and Central Asia. The topic today is public-private partnerships, challenges and consequences for education. And as you may know, compulsory education is mostly national in terms of accreditation, teaching content, and language of instruction. However, we are seeing more and more the case in different jurisdictions where private sector has managed to scale up the influence on what public schools are doing and how the public education is regulated. So private providers are also able to orient themselves and operate both at national and international level. We will see that mostly private is taking the place at the international level, whereas public is remaining national. And precisely because this new role of the private sector, it's very pertinent to raise questions and critical questions as to what happens when business thinking takes over the public education sector. Is it good or bad that we speak of preoccupation with cost-benefit, demand supply, and measurable outcomes? And also, should the private sector at the global level disrupt and the public one, is it good or bad? So all these questions will be addressed by Gita in a few minutes. I will just conclude by reminding everyone of the format of the session. Gita will be speaking for about 20 to 30 minutes, and then we will open the floor for questions and answers. And without further ado, Gita, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Diego, and also Sophie Fleury for this invitation. It will be a difficult task to be louder than the noise in the renovation, so let's get started and hope that there is a break in between, that they have a lunch break. I would like to start with a picture to show you how public education used to be. And the question I have is, how did we get from public education, 1820, around the Bell-Lancaster model of education, to the situation now where education is a mixture of public and private? Just as a reminder, education as a project of the nation state is relatively new. It's mid-19th century. It got disseminated by 2 very important educators, Bell and Lancaster. That's why it's called Bell-Lancaster. And because they had a lack of teachers, they would have 1 teacher in front, usually in big rooms with 300, 400, 500 students, and then they would have students working as monitors, usually older students helping the teacher. Now, over 200 years, the classroom became more and more standardized and homogenized. Classes became age homogeneous. They became more and more homogeneous in terms of performance. Everything was done in the name of the students, so the students could be individually promoted. This is the history of schooling, and the history of schooling as a project of modernization and the nation state is that education became the means for social cohesion, because everyone is learning the same language, the same history, the same geography, but also for social mobility. The idea that there is a need for compulsory education so that everyone in society has the chance to be part of the elite. That's the project of schooling, modern schooling. And it has become a public project to have compulsory education. Now, there's different ways to look at PPP, or public-private partnership. One is to say, to be marveled at the spread, how this model has really taken on in all aspects of life. Health, education, everything, businesses, the private sector. And another way is to look at the different forms of PPP, how they have evolved over time. What I'm interested in my own work is to look at the transformative power of PPP on public education. How did that existence, that collaboration between the public and private sector impact public education or education? And this is what I would like to talk about. So this is how it used to be. This is how it is today. Let me explain to you what I mean. Starting in the 1990s, there's a model that was spread, and we call it the market model in education. And the idea, it was a neoliberal idea. The idea is that if you do three things: you give parental choice, you give choice to parents so that parents can choose the school of their child. Once parents have the choice, the idea was they would send the child to the school that performs well. Once schools manage to attract a lot of students because they're performing well, this will create competition, and that competition will improve the quality of education. That was the idea of the market model in education, that it's demand-supply driven. So in the dark red, you have these three elements of the market model in education. But there is also, of course, a PPP environment that needs to be created to make this happen. And there were a lot of policies passed, a lot of regulations passed to propel and advance this model. For instance, you had to have a regulatory guarantee for school choice. In Switzerland, for instance, we only have that at secondary school level. We don't have school choice at primary school level, unless you go to a private school. Then you need to have entrance rules for private providers. The idea was, by having this model, everyone should be able to provide schooling, not just the government. That was the whole idea of this market model, that you allow for multiple providers to enter the education market. So you have bidding entrance rules for private providers. Sometimes they're called accreditation rules and what have you. Then you need to have an evaluation system, and we will talk a lot about that. This means you have to see how the quality of the school is that is being offered by different providers. And this is done by tests, student assessments, etc. It's not enough to just test students, you have to make it public. So some education systems, starting in the 1990s, put the scores of the schools on the website of the schools, or they disseminate it. And you have to have an incentive scheme, a financial incentive schemes, and most education systems, and that was a global reform, moved away from what we used to call incremental funding from last year, the budget, to per capita financing, that the school gets money based on the number of students, making it attractive to the school to attract a lot of students. So this is there's a logic, and I'm trying to say there's a logic to this PPP. It's a market-driven logic, it's a neoliberal logic, but this is the logic of why PPP functions and why it became a global reform. Because one education system after another started to introduce choice, started to allow private providers, in fact, encourage them to come and open schools. One system after the other introduced student tests or student assessments. This is the situation that we have today of PPP. Let me move on and show you the different forms that now exist. There is, of course, a continuum. There is PPP pure, or 100%, which is high PPP at the right side. And this is, I have this from actually the World Bank, from Patrinos. He put that chart together. So you have high PPP, where I would say the US is a good example, or Chile used to be a good example, where the money follows the student and it's 100, it doesn't matter whether the money is spent in private schools or in public schools, and they are treated as equal. Then you have on the left side, low PPP, where it's strictly public system. I would say Mongolia, Central Asia is like that, the ones with the Soviet past. The government does both the regulation of schools, the financing of schools, but also the provision. So this is, and within this you have different types. So I just looked at the OECD, there are different reasons why there is PPP. It's not just only private sector in the sense of businesses or non-profit, but also, for instance, Belgium and the Netherlands have a high level, traditionally, of the private sector because of religious schools, Catholic schools, or Protestant schools. But also Hong Kong has a high level of private schools for different reasons, and Singapore, and on the low end are former Soviet countries, only because, in general, they have lower private sector involvement. Switzerland is low. It's 5 to 6% of schools are private schools. And what I'm interested in is not so much the private schools themselves, because the private schools have an interesting history of their own, and being in Geneva, it's important to know that Ecolind is the first international schools. They offer the international baccalaureate. And it caters to and continues to cater to a multinational community or to expats. That's the origin of private schools. In former times, in the British private school debate, it had also to do with the colonial history of the country. So it was the place where parents that were dispatched to the colonies and dependent states would send their children to the homeland to be in their schools because they were boarding schools, etc. What is really interesting is a new phenomenon, that it is, even in Switzerland, across the spectrum of PPP that you see here, the combination, the hybrid model, where you have public schools, but within public schools, you have private provisions. And that is growing enormously. Let me bring you the example of IB, because we're in Geneva and because it's a good school. So IB grew in general, the primary school, the primary years program, green, then the middle years program, red. This is 100% private. And then what massively grew over the last few years is the diploma program, which is offered in the last 2 years of secondary school. So to understand this figure, you can only understand it if you see the hybrid form of IB, but I could also talk about Cambridge International or others, but let's just talk about IB. There are schools, including in Switzerland, which has a very low PPP, remember, private sector ratio of all the schools. They offer IB as a track within public schools. This is a totally new phenomenon that you have in the lycée or gymnasium. You have one IB track where students can choose the IB diploma program in addition to the Swiss certification. So they have a dual certification, Swiss certification and an international certification. So what you end up having is a transnational private accreditation in a national public school. And this is very, very interesting as a new phenomenon. And the reason why this is, and I'm from Basel originally, and in Basel it is the one gymnasium that was offering Typus A, Greek, which was very unpopular, and they were losing students. So this was a way to make it popular again by answering to the demand of parents to have English as a language of instruction in some subjects. And in developing countries, this internationalization in public school coming from the private sector a few years ago was not just only because of English as a language of instruction, but also because of technology, because the private sector had easier access to technology, and also because the private sector, such as the Gates and Dell and others, invested in these kind of special schools. So this is what we're talking about, how the public school system is changing as a result of private sector involvement. And these hybrid models are like that's a new topic to look at more closely to understand what's going on. So this is the huge growth, and it keeps continuing to grow. And IB is not, I didn't choose it because of Geneva only. It is the biggest private school provider, followed by Cambridge International. What is interesting, as I said, it used to be that the government or the state would do all three things. It would regulate schools by having laws and regulations, by establishing standards and defining what the curriculum should be. Then it would finance schools from taxes, and it would provide schools, run schools, implement schools. Because of this market model in education that started 20, 30 years ago, the state has withdrawn its role and is focusing now on regulating the schools and financing schools. And the provision of schools is open to everyone. That's the whole idea of this market model. And the idea to regulate schools is done by outcomes orientation, we call that. It used to be when I worked in the ministry, we would also regulate schools. We would do surprise visits to schools. That was the kind of regulation we would do. Regulation in the 21st century is different. The 21st century, you have standards, you have benchmarks, you have expected outcomes, and you go and see whether they are accomplished. And when it comes to schools and education, the outcomes are always student learning outcomes or tests. So as a result of this change, where the government broke, to use the language of the neoliberal language, broke the state monopoly on education, that was the critique of education. As a result of that, there's more and more tests in schools of students. And this is another thing. The first one is the internationalization of public education as a result of private sector involvement. The second one is the enormous amount of tests that have come to schools. And not just tests for students to get feedback on how they are doing, what we would call formative evaluation, but summative or test-based accountability. So test-based accountability means having more and more PISA, TIMSS, PEARLS, all these international large-scale assessments. Students don't really know how, it's not a tool to improve student learning, it's more a tool to control the school and the quality of the education system. So it doesn't really benefit students, it's supposed to benefit the policymakers that need to make policy decisions. Now you have PISA for development. PISA is done all 3 years. It's a test everyone takes at the same day. It's done all 3 years. Over 80 countries participate now. Now you have also PISA for development, you have PISA for schools, you have PISA for babies, and you have PISA for you. So the testing has really taken off massively in the number of countries that participate, but also in the number of tests that educational systems are taking. Let me move on to show that this environment is also in development studies or in development work. And the idea of regulating by evaluating outcomes is something that is, of course, not only in education, but this is the general work environment, including in the other field where we work a lot in comparative education, we work a lot in development. We work a lot in development projects and development. So it has become the new normal to have results-based aid. The World Bank calls that programs for result. And the idea is that you give some money for a project, but you withhold some of the payment until the results are achieved. So it has different names. The idea is to say it was framed as something positive, so let me say it positively, that it's a hands-off approach. Same with market model. The ones that are supporting it, they say it's a hands-off approach, rather than the government interfering and saying how things need to be done. You leave freedom on how it is done and who is doing it, as long as the results are achieved. Same with aid. Results-based aid, the idea is there is more freedom to the government to implement the projects as long as they can demonstrate the result. That's the logic. That's how it is sold as a positive idea. GPE is a wonderful donor, actually. From all the donors we have, they're very much into ensuring that there is equity. So their model is actually relatively a good model given this pressure to move towards results-based aid. They give 70% of the grant to the recipient government if 3 bigger conditions are fulfilled. One is they have to have a credible education sector plan, because in aid, governments are not supposed to support ideas that they like, but they're supposed to support ideas that the government wants. So they need to have like education sector review, education sector plan. They need to show the recipient government that they commit 20% of their national budget to education, which is a good condition, I would say. And the other condition is 45% of the national education budget has to go to primary school, which again, I would say is also a good condition, because it does not make sense to put money into higher education, because the masses of a population is in primary school. And finally, and that's the third transformative aspect of PPP, there needs to be availability of data. You would think, why is that so important? But it is linked with results-based or knowledge-based or evidence-based regulation, the need to monitor the outcomes. So this obsession with AMIS that is taking place for 20 years now, education management and information system in education, is related to this outcomes-based regulation. You need to have data, you need to have a baseline, you need to have midterm targets, you need to have benchmarks to see whether the project or the program has achieved its results. So this 70% of the funding is given if these conditions are fulfilled, but 30% are withheld towards the end of the project when proof has been brought that because of the program, there is more equity, there is more efficiency, and students have learned something. So this is an example of a results-based aid modality. Asian development banks have different ones, World Bank, DFID have different ones, but this is a simple one, and I think even compared to others, a good one, because equity is part of the formula. It's not, so they are aware that it could be very unequitable to have results-based aid, and we will talk about that in the discussion, I hope. Another Swiss invention, not the first, but very much known, is UBS's work with innovative financing or development impact bonds. The idea that wealthy individuals could give money for social projects or education projects or health projects. In this case, this is an example of Educate Girls. That's a project in Rajasthan. So UBS gets money from wealthy individuals, gives it to the provider, but dependent on that independent evaluation, and it has to be independent, that's a big part of that formula, there will be additional money brought in to a different foundation, to the Children's Investment Fund, to the CIF. So based on the report on the outcome. There are different formats, but there are core elements to this. One is that some money is withheld until the outcome is there. And the other element is that needs to be an independent evaluation. And again, that's a third element of PPP, how it transforms the way we do projects or the way we do education. The reliance on data. The reliance on data has become a big new phenomenon, and I think as a result also of PPP. Another example is Human Capital Project of the World Bank. You probably heard about it. We used to work, or in parallel, we still have, the Human Development Index, HDI. The World Bank, together with UNESCO Statistics Montreal, has introduced a new measure. It's called Human Capital Index, HCI. And the idea is to calculate how productive one person in a country is, on average, for the economy in that country, to predict the productivity based on a couple of predictors. One of them is stunting, which does not apply in Switzerland and other countries, but it's a universal one. It's not just for poor countries. It's a universal measure. Another one is adult survival rate, which is similar to the old UNDP or UN, the HDI. Then probability of survival to age 5. It's all part of that index. Then two things that are related to education, and that's what's interesting. Not only expected years of schooling, but effective years of schooling, adjusted for learning. So there's a difference between countries, how long you have to go to school and how much you learn in that school. So Singapore is actually taken as a benchmark for the most effective school system in the world, because students waste the least of the time in the Singaporean education system. And I hope we have a time for discussion so we can discuss that also, because it has been criticized that Singapore has been taken as a benchmark. But the way it is calculated is, it's usually taken PISA results and TIMSS, but also regional student assessment tests are taken, and based on the scores, the years of schooling are adjusted for learning. So for instance, you see Singapore is all orange because they don't waste anything, time. But in South Africa, students are supposed to go on average 11 years to school, but in reality, they only go 5.9 years to school. That's what it means. So they subtract 5.1 years in South Africa. In Egypt, students are supposed to go to school for 10 years on average, starting from preschool age, not just first grade. But in effect, they only go 6.3 years because that's how much they learn. Switzerland, I looked up Switzerland for you. You would be surprised that the World Bank also subtracts years for Switzerland, and was also very much debated. So Switzerland, students are supposed to go to school for 13 years. And you can look it up, it's under the GPS, under Human Capital Index. They're supposed to go to school 13.3 years. Let me just read it for you. In Switzerland, a child who starts school at age 4 can expect to complete 13.3 years of school by her 18th birthday. Now, difference. Learning adjusted years of school in Switzerland. Factoring in what children actually learn in Switzerland, expected years of school is only 11.1 years. So in Switzerland, 2.2 years of a child's life is wasted. If the school system would be better, school could be shorter by 2.2 years. I'm just showing you this development on the HCI to show that this is yet another manifestation how important learning or outcomes or results have become, so much so that it's used as a measure for productivity, for economic productivity in countries. Let me summarize, so we have time for discussion. The transformative power of PPP. Remember, this is what I'm really interested in, to understand what's happening to the public education system because of PPP. It's as same, we could ask, what is the transformative power of globalization on education? Or of the financial crisis on education, or right-wing populism on education. There are a zillion things we could be asking. But here we ask, what is the transformative power of PPP on education? And there are 4 things that I find striking and interesting to look into, because it's a relatively new research area to look at it this way. One is the focus on outcomes, results, and tests. PPP necessitates a focus on tests, but also exacerbates it. So it's both. There is a need to be outcomes-oriented in order to allow private providers to come in. But once you have private providers come in, they exacerbate that trend also. Then the focus on data, the focus on the evaluation of outcomes, such as tests or results, and also the focus on transnationalism. And this is something to come back to the beginning. As you recall, this was the image that I showed you in the beginning, the idea that compulsory education should be something that modern states should advance, because if you think of society as a pyramid with the elites at the top and the masses at the bottom, it is in the interest of a government or a state to have social cohesion, to have people in the country learn the same language, the same history, geography. It's a common knowledge, right? It's called social cohesion, and this is horizontally when you look at it as a pyramid. And vertically, in a modern nation state, you have to give the chance to everyone to move away from what someone is from birth, ascribed status, to what they have achieved themselves. That's the project of modernization or modernity. So education has an important role to play for social mobility. Of course, critics would say, this is a model. In reality, what education does, it perpetuates the myth that if you learn hard enough, if you work hard enough, the world is open for you. Education perpetuates that myth, critics would say. So social mobility, education is part of that myth-making apparatus of the state. And others would say also critically, social cohesion, if you look at it, it has been at the expense of bilingual students, minorities. So this social cohesion sometimes is more like assimilation and oppression of ethnic minorities and what have you. But this is the model of education and nation building and the nation state. This is the model of education and modernization. And the last slide I want to show you, it has to do with transnationalism, that at the end of the day, in an era of globalization, and that's where the nexus between globalization and private sector come to play, and the book that I think it's part of the launch that we have this talk here deals with this nexus between globalization and privatization. The big advantage that the private sector has towards the public sector is that it can be transnational. The public sector, by definition, is national. It used not to be a problem, but now it is a problem. And national is seen, especially for middle-class parents that want to have student mobility, child mobility for their children, is seen as parochial, backward, and international, such as IB or transnational accreditation, is seen as something positive, cosmopolitan, something that is for the 21st century. So the public sector is in deep trouble these days in education to compete with the private sector that is much freer in terms of which history they teach, which language they teach, how they prepare their students. So the project of being national, social cohesion, social mobility, it sounded better in other times than it sounds now, because the private sector now is competing with the public sector, and the public sector is trying to, in an attempt to survive, tries to be creative in doing all kinds of hybrid forms of education. Let me stop here so we can have a discussion on some of these topics. Thank you so much.
Okay, Okay, many thanks, Gita. We're going to open the floor for discussions. We have about 15 minutes. So if you want to ask a question, please raise your hand and the microphone will come around. So let's start here.
Hi.
And if you can say your name and your affiliation, please.
Okay. Hi, my name is Lincoln Ojoko. I work at World Economic Forum. I worked in the education sector, so a lot of this resonates, so thank you for the presentation, and particularly international development and GPE and sector plans. My question is, you kind of went to it at the end, but what do you think? And I ask that in terms of, is this working, this new shift? And where is it working in your assessment, and where is it not? That's the first part. And then the second part, seeing the Human Capital Index made me think, you talked a lot about competition within countries between public and private. There's also global competition. The Singapores, the Hong Kongs, Switzerlands, and people in the US or South Africa might ask, why don't we have systems like those? Can you talk about like maybe how impractical or how difficult it is for large geographic and countries, populations to sort of emulate city-state and much smaller country systems?
So these were all both very good points that you made. The first one is what I think personally. I think some of the impetus that is done is good. For instance, the internationalization of public schooling, I think it's a good thing. And the question is, at the end of the day, if you allow the private sector to use private sector principles of cost effectiveness, demand supply driven, if you don't have any values such as equity as an outcomes measurement, for me that becomes very problematic, because in school, and there's actually the discussion whether schools or education is a good field for social impact investments or for innovative financing, because the effects of education are not immediate. It's not like health. You die or don't die or you become healthy again. In education, it's a long-term effect. So the question, how does the private sector deal with the fact that you only know in 5-10 years whether the education was worth it or not? So there are some principled issues that also are being discussed in our field, whether education should be exempt or there should be additional conditions. And the other thing is, in education, some children are more expensive than others because they don't have resourceful backgrounds where they have help at home. Bilingual children cost more, students with special needs cost more. So unless you regulate and insist on social principles, they will be excluded from schooling, and the private sector would go for the low-hanging fruits or low-hanging students. The second one on the differences in education systems, the Hong Kongs, the Switzerlands, and the Singapores. In fact, there's a lot of convergence among the education systems, but not so much coming from those countries, but because of PISA. You know, PISA is a test that is done all 3 years. PISA is different than other tests that we used to have, like TIMSS and PEARLS. PISA measures 21st century skills. It does not measure whether the curriculum of that country has been fully implemented, whether the teachers teach it well, but it measures one universal skill set, and that in itself brings a convergence, or school systems become more and more similar, which again, I would say the private sector loves that, because standardization is good for business. The more similar education systems become, the bigger the scale of the textbooks, the teacher training, what have you, where one and the same business can sell it globally. So we have this convergence in education, but I think because of PISA, because they indirectly prescribe the same curriculum, same kind of curriculum for the countries.
Thank you. Let's gather now some questions. We have one question there, another question in the back, and yeah, another question there.
My question is, you didn't mention anything about Finland in this discussion, and Finland is constantly discussion in education as a model for many reasons, and I was very curious how Finland fits into the discussion on public-private and testing and all these other things, because I think that's very interesting.
Thank you very much for this very interesting presentation. Christoph Stückelberger, President of GlobalEthics.net, just in the neighborhood of this institute. We work a lot on ethics in higher education, and I'm interested in this index of the gap between the number of school years and the effectivity. What is measured as effective? Because, for example, we know that children who play just in free time, unstructured, is a very important part of the brain development. So innovation in a non-structured way. So has that a room in that measurement? Because losing years, for one is losing, for the other one it was not a loss. It's the creative part of development. So how do you measure effective learning? That's my question. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Isabelle Milbert. I am an honorary professor here. I really felt like a dinosaur listening to yours, having been taught in government schools and having been educated also there. So I had a number of questions. Just to summarize, the public sector still has the redistributive quality. Another point is the fact that tests may be totally misleading concerning the different characters and personalities of students. And my question was therefore, and another point also, you were speaking about the teaching in the private sector as international citizens. I have not seen much in the private sector of teaching as citizens at all. So we could imagine also that on the one hand there would be a nice education on what is a citizen, whether at the national and international level. And so this leads me to the questioning, do you think that today there would be a room for both? That is, that the public sector could take away a number of the qualities from the private sector, and that the private sector could be maybe more adapted to the requisite of the mass of the students and not only to an elite, which is the case at the moment. Yeah. Thank you.
I think these are all very good questions, and let me start answering some of them, and then hopefully there's time for more. Finland is an interesting case because absolutely it is very low private sector involvement, and it has scored on top. The neighboring country, Sweden, has had a big wave of privatization in the school system, and their PISA scores dropped, so much so that Andreas Schleicher himself said that idea of the private sector involvement getting so much, even for profit in Sweden, was a bad idea, and he advised them to curb down on for-profit privatization, because there's also, like IB is private, but it's a non-profit. So there is also a big difference between the private sector that works in education for profit and the ones that work non-profit. Finland, by the way, tomorrow is, and that's related with the third input that we had. Tomorrow is the launch of the World Happiness Report, where my colleague from the other university, from Columbia, Jeffrey Sachs, is a co-author. And Finland moved up in the happiness scores. It was always Denmark, Norway, and Switzerland, the most happiest countries on 6 indicators, and Finland moved up. So Finland does it right, and I think the reason why they do it right is they have very little tests actually in the schools. Teachers give a lot of feedback. There's a strong teacher education system, and but the interesting thing about league leaders is everyone interprets differently why they're doing well. So I just finished another book with my colleague Florian Waldo on PISA success, how policymakers in different countries explain Finland or Singapore. Everyone has a different explanation depending on what point they want to make in their own country. So, but Finland is an interesting case. The HCI point on human capital index, you know, this obsession with measuring everything is now beyond numeracy and literacy. And in fact, you know, OECD itself, who is the architect, the implementer of PISA, they also measure financial literacy, global citizenship in the next one. There's a whole industry out there to measure social emotional learning, happiness. So the idea that you can have indicators for everything, I think we are at the interesting stage where just in general there's too much measurement and too much datafication on everything. And some would say, like if we would be in actor network theory or science technology studies, we would say it has to do with internet and with computers. The fact that we have computers and data allows for data mining. And once you have data mining, then everything becomes an algorithm and you start measuring everything, and you use measures for governance, for regulation, for financing, for results-based financing, etc. So it is an interesting phenomenon that measurement is now far beyond numeracy and literacy. It used to be that schools were criticized for only differentiating between majeur and mineur, and that it's all about math and language. I wish it would only be math and language. Now everything is being measured and tested. The last point is interesting. It's a very complex question to answer, but I think one about global citizenship. I think IB actually does promote global citizenship and cosmopolitanism. That's a big part of their belief system, but the public education system, I know in Switzerland, Lehrplan 21, for instance, I think the time is up. They have education for sustainable development. The whole debate on sustainable development and ecology, that's where global citizenship also comes into bear, because you cannot have sustainable development unless you pull down national boundaries and you assume that there is such a thing as a global responsibility and global citizenship. And I think that's how the public education system tries to bring in internationalism or global citizenship, and I think in a good way, actually.
Thanks. Sorry for the noise. Thank you everyone who participated. I'm sorry for those that were willing to ask a question. We didn't have the time. And please join me in thanking Professor Steiner-Khamsi for this wonderful presentation.